She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She did not even reach for the phone that was sitting 6 inches from her hand on the kitchen table. My grandmother, Dorothy Mercer, 79 years old, sharp as she had ever been, with a memory that could recall the price of a can of soup from 1987, sat in that vinyl chair in her kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, and she said absolutely nothing. And for a long time, I thought that silence meant she did not understand what had happened. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. It took me almost 2 years, one very patient estate attorney, and a second folder that he should have showed me on the very first day, but did not, to understand that my grandmother's silence was not confusion. It was grief. And it was something else, too. Something I still have trouble naming without my chest tightening. It was shame. Because here is the thing, no one tells you when someone steals from an elderly person in your family. The conversation nobody wants to have at the dinner table, or at the lawyer's office, or at the funeral home when you are making arrangements and trying to hold yourself together. They almost always get away with it. Not because the evidence is not there. Not because the courts do not care. Not because the money disappears into some offshore account that nobody can find. They get away with it because the family falls apart before it can hold itself together long enough to fight. This is the story of how mine almost did. And what happened when I decided it would not. I need to tell you who my grandmother was before I tell you what happened to her. Because if I skip that part, none of the rest of it lands right. You will hear the numbers, and the numbers are significant. But numbers without a person attached to them are just math. And this is not a story about math. Dorothy Mercer was born in 1944, in a small house outside of Brunswick, Georgia. She married my grandfather, Harold, when she was 22 years old. He worked in marine shipping logistics. She kept the books for 3 different small businesses in their county, not because she had a degree, but because people trusted her, because she was precise, because she remembered everything. They were not wealthy. They were careful. Harold died in 2009. Prostate cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to gone. And when he died, he left Dorothy with a paid-off house in Savannah, worth approximately $410,000 at that time, a savings account that they had been building quietly for 40 years, 2 life insurance policies, and a brokerage account that Harold had started in the mid-90s on the advice of a colleague at his shipping company. Together, the estate was valued at somewhere between $1.7 and $1.9 million, depending on the market. Dorothy Mercer was not the kind of woman who wore her money. She drove a 2006 Buick LeSabre until it died. She still clipped paper coupons from the Sunday paper. She heated leftovers in a microwave that was at least 15 years old and refused to replace it because, as she put it, the door still closes fine. But she knew exactly what she had, and she knew exactly what Harold had intended for it. Half to my mother, Patricia. My mother's name is Patricia Mercer Collins. She is the eldest of Dorothy's 3 children. A quarter to my uncle, Gregory Mercer. He is the middle child. He lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. And the remaining quarter to my aunt, Susan Voss. Susan is the youngest. She married into that last name. She lives 15 minutes from Dorothy's house in Savannah. Harold had this written into a will in 2004. It was clear. It was notarized. It was witnessed. There was no ambiguity. Susan knew that. I grew up spending summers in that Savannah house. I can close my eyes right now and tell you exactly what it smelled like in August, the mix of gardenias from the side garden and the particular brand of lemon dish soap Dorothy used. And underneath all of that, this faint wood smell that I think was just the age of the house itself soaking into the walls. She taught me how to play gin rummy on the screened-in porch. She let me stay up past my bedtime watching old movies she had on VHs. She had this laugh, this specific, full-bodied laugh, that would come out of nowhere when something struck her as genuinely funny. Not a polite laugh. A real one. She was the kind of grandmother who sent birthday cards that arrived exactly on the right day, every single year, with a handwritten note inside that was never generic. She paid attention to what you had said the last time she saw you, and she referenced it. She remembered. After Harold died, something shifted in her. Not dramatically. Not in a way that alarmed anyone at first. She was still sharp, still present, still her. But the house was big, and it was quiet, and I think the quiet started to settle into her bones, in a way that was hard to see unless you were paying close attention. My mother was in Atlanta. Gregory was in Raleigh. They visited. They called. But the day-to-day proximity, that was Susan. Susan, who lived 15 minutes away. Susan, who started stopping by more regularly around 2011, about 2 years after Harold passed. Susan, who Dorothy started relying on for rides to doctor appointments. And then for grocery runs. And then for help with the mail. The mail. I want you to hold that detail. It seems small. I promise you it is not small. The first time I personally noticed something was strange, it was Thanksgiving of 2018. I was 26 years old at the time. I had driven down from Charlotte, I was living there for work, and I spent the holiday weekend at Dorothy's house. Susan was there, naturally. Her husband, Dale, was there. Their son, Marcus, came by on Thursday afternoon and left early Friday morning. The meal was fine. The conversation was fine. But at one point, Dorothy was telling a story about something that had happened at her bank. Something about a signature card that needed to be updated, and Susan interrupted her. Not rudely. Just smoothly. Like someone changing a television channel before the show gets to the part they do not want you to see. She said, "Mom, we already handled that. Remember? You do not need to worry about that anymore." And Dorothy looked at her. Just for a second. And then she nodded and said, "Right. Right." And moved on to something else. I watched that exchange from across the table and felt something register in the back of my mind. Not alarm, exactly. More like a small notch carved into a wall, a mark. I filed it away and did not take it out again for another 8 months, which I will regret for the rest of my life. If this story is already making you feel something, if you have ever watched someone you love get slowly managed out of their own decisions, I want you to know you are not alone. Stories like this happen more than people realize. That is exactly why I share them. Over the next year, I heard things in pieces. Not because anyone was hiding them from me, exactly. More because my family operated in that very particular Southern way, where you do not discuss discomfort until it becomes undeniable. You talk around it. You say things like, "Susan has been such a help with Mama," and "Mama seems settled," and nobody asks what settled actually means. My mother mentioned in passing that Dorothy had added Susan as a joint account holder on her primary checking account. Apparently, this had been done so Susan could help manage bills. My mother said Dorothy had agreed to it and seemed comfortable with the arrangement. I asked if she had talked to Dorothy directly about it. She said, "Well, your grandmother is fine with it." I asked again, had she talked to Dorothy directly? There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long, and then my mother said she trusted Susan. The distinction between those two things, trusting Susan and talking to Dorothy, that distinction right there is where everything started to go wrong. And nobody caught it. Not me, not my mother, not Gregory, who was the farthest away and perhaps the easiest to keep in the dark. In the spring of 2019, Dorothy fell. Not badly. She caught herself on the kitchen counter. No broken bones, no hospital visit. But Susan used that fall to suggest that Dorothy might benefit from having Susan stop by every day, just to check in. Dorothy agreed. By the summer of 2019, Susan had a key to the house. By the fall of 2019, Susan had access to Dorothy's email account. Because Dorothy had trouble with passwords. Because the computer was confusing. Because Susan was just trying to help. I am not even kidding when I tell you how ordinary each of these steps sounded in isolation. That is the part that keeps me up at night. None of it sounded like theft. Each piece sounded like care. Here is what I did not know yet. I did not know that in March of 2019, 2 months before Dorothy's fall, 1 month before the joint account, Susan had taken my grandmother to see an attorney in Savannah. Not the attorney the family had used for Harold's estate. A different one. A man named Raymond Doyle, who had an office off Abercorn Street. I did not know that, at that meeting, my grandmother had signed a new power of attorney document. A very broad one. One that gave Susan authority over Dorothy's finances, medical decisions, and property management. I did not know that 3 weeks after that document was signed, Susan began making transfers from Dorothy's brokerage account. And I did not know, could not have known, that when I finally walked into an attorney's office of my own, nearly 18 months later, The man across the desk from me would set a folder on the table, let me look through it, and then, very quietly, reach under his desk and bring out a second one. And that second folder. That second folder was the moment everything I thought I understood about my family turned to smoke. Let me tell you how I found out. Not the full story. Not all at once. That is not how these things work. You do not get a single phone call that explains everything. You get pieces. You get a sentence here, a silence there, and then one ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October of 2020, you get a voicemail from your mother. That sounds just slightly too careful. The kind of careful that people use when they have already been sitting with something for a few hours and have decided that the version they are going to tell you will be the version they can manage. My mother's message said, "Sweetheart, I need to talk to you about something involving your grandmother's finances. Nothing is wrong. I just want to go over a few things. Call me when you have a minute." Nothing is wrong. 4 words that have never, in the history of anyone saying them, accurately described the situation that followed. I called her back within 20 minutes. She was in her kitchen in Atlanta. I could hear the refrigerator hum in the background, and the distant sound of a television 2 rooms away. And she told me, in measured sentences, that she had been looking at some of Dorothy's financial statements. She had gotten access as part of preparing to update some insurance paperwork, and she had noticed some transfers that she could not immediately explain. I asked, "How large?" She paused. Then she said, "The ones I can identify so far come to about $340,000. Over roughly 19 months. I sat down on the floor of my apartment in Charlotte. Not because my legs gave out, I just needed to be lower to the ground somehow. The carpet smelled like dust, and the radiator was clicking, and I remember thinking, this does not feel real. And also, I knew. I knew the moment she said the word transfers that this was Susan. I do not know how I knew. I just did. My mother did not want to confront Susan directly. Not yet. Not without more information, she said. She did not want to accuse anyone. She did not want to cause a rift. She kept using that word, rift, as if the thing that Susan had done was less significant than the argument that naming it might create. I understand that now, in a way I could not then. My mother had grown up watching Susan be the baby of the family, the one who got away with things because she was the youngest and smallest and most easily tearful. Dorothy had softened for Susan in ways she had not for my mother or for Gregory. And my mother had spent 50 years absorbing that particular unfairness in silence. And confronting Susan now meant also confronting all of that. The favoritism, the imbalance, the years of quiet resentment she had never fully allowed herself to feel. So she hesitated. And Susan, whether she sensed something or simply kept moving because that is what she had always done, did not slow down. In November of 2020, while my mother was still deciding how to approach the situation carefully, Susan filed an updated beneficiary designation on one of Dorothy's investment accounts. She listed herself as the sole primary beneficiary. Dorothy's signature was on the form. I will come back to that signature. I drove to Savannah the second weekend of November. I told no one I was going. Not my mother. Not Gregory. Not Susan. Dorothy was in the kitchen when I arrived. She had been expecting me, I had called ahead, and she had made a pot of coffee and set out a plate of those shortbread cookies she always kept in a tin on the counter. The kitchen smelled like coffee and that lemon soap and something else I could not name. Something slightly medicinal. The kind of smell that settles into a house when someone is getting older, and the routines of managing that are quietly multiplying. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where I had watched Susan redirect her at Thanksgiving 2 years earlier. And I looked at my grandmother. Her hair still set the way she had always worn it, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her eyes clear and direct. And I told her I had some questions about her finances, and I needed her to be honest with me. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "I know. Just that. 2 words. I know." I asked her what she knew, and she looked down at the table and said that she had let Susan handle things because it was easier. Because after Harold died, the paperwork felt like it was in a language she no longer fully understood. And Susan was right there, and Susan always had an explanation. And after a while, it had seemed like less effort to simply agree than to ask questions that would make Susan frustrated with her. She said, I did not want to be a burden. I have thought about that sentence almost every day since she said it. My grandmother, a woman who kept books for 3 businesses by hand, who raised 3 children, who managed a household for 40 years, who could remember the price of a can of soup from 1987. Reduced to not wanting to be a burden. By her own daughter. In her own house. I asked her if she had understood what she was signing when she gave Susan the power of attorney. She said she had thought it was just for medical decisions, in case something happened to her. Susan had told her it was routine, that everyone did it at her age. The weight of this. She had not read it fully. She had trusted her daughter. And I sat there in that kitchen, with my cold coffee and those shortbread cookies going soft, and I understood, for the first time, the full shape of what had been done to her. Be honest with me for a second. If you were sitting across from your grandmother right now and she told you something like this, what would you have done? I genuinely want to know, because I almost walked away. I almost told myself it was complicated, and let my mother handle it. And I am so grateful I did not. I made one mistake when I got back to Charlotte. I told my mother what Dorothy had said. Not because I should not have, but because my mother, still caught between her own grief and her old habits around Susan, made the decision to call Gregory. And Gregory, in the blundering, well-intentioned way that Gregory tends to do things, called Susan. Within 48 hours, Susan had called my mother, called Gregory, and sent me a text message that said, "I think we need to talk as a family. Mama is confused, and I am worried about her memory. I have been doing everything I can to help her, and I think it would be a good idea to have her assessed. Mama is confused." There it was. Susan did not address the transfers. She did not address the power of attorney. She did not address the beneficiary change. She went directly to Dorothy's mental state, the one variable in the entire situation that could, if accepted, explain away everything else. If Dorothy was confused, then Dorothy might have misunderstood the documents she signed. If Dorothy was confused, then her account of the Thanksgiving conversation was unreliable. If Dorothy was confused, then everything she had told me in that kitchen was the distorted memory of a woman whose mind was slipping. It was elegant, in a cold way. I will give her that. And for about 4 days, it worked on me. I am not proud of that. I started second-guessing what Dorothy had said. I started wondering if I had led her somehow, if she had been telling me what she thought I wanted to hear. If I had misread the situation, because I wanted there to be a clear villain, and Susan was the easiest candidate. 4 days. And then I called the estate attorney. His name was Thomas Whitfield. He had an office in Columbia, South Carolina, far enough from Savannah that Susan would not know I had retained him, close enough that I could drive there without an overnight stay. I found him through a colleague at work whose family had dealt with something similar. Not identical, but similar enough that when she described what her family had gone through, I felt that particular recognition that comes when someone names a thing you have been experiencing without a name. I sat in Thomas Whitfield's office on a Thursday afternoon in late November of 2020 with a folder I had put together myself. Bank statements my mother had photographed. The dates of the transfers she had identified. The date the power of attorney had been filed. The beneficiary change. Notes from my conversation with Dorothy, written down that same night, while the details were still exact in my mind. Thomas looked through everything without speaking. He had one of those faces that gives nothing away, not because he was cold, but because he was precise. He understood that his reaction in that moment would color everything I told him after it. Become steadier. This is the pivot point. When he finished, he set the folder down and said, "This is a stronger case than most of what comes through my door. That does not mean it is simple. But you have done good work pulling this together." Then he told me what I needed. I needed Dorothy's complete financial records for the past 3 years. Every account, every statement, every transaction. I needed the original power of attorney document, not a copy. I needed to determine whether Dorothy had been seen by her physician around the time she signed it, because if she had, those medical records could speak to her cognitive state at the time of signing. I needed to document every transfer Susan had made, and trace where those funds had gone. And I needed Dorothy's cooperation, because without Dorothy's participation, the case became significantly harder to prosecute. Dorothy, who had spent 40 years not wanting to be a burden. Dorothy, who still loved Susan. I drove back to Charlotte that night and did not sleep. The coffee I had drunk on the way home had gone cold in the cup holder, and the highway was dark and mostly empty, and I kept running the math in my head. Not the dollar figures. Those almost did not feel real yet, but the human math. What it would cost Dorothy to go through this. What it would cost the family. Whether the fight was worth the damage it would do on the way to whatever resolution waited at the end of it. I decided it was. And then, I made a list. The next 6 weeks were the least cinematic 6 weeks of my life. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no single revelation that cracked everything open. There was just work. I requested Dorothy's bank records going back 3 years. This required Dorothy to sign a release form, which meant I had to explain to her, carefully, without alarming her, without making her feel like the situation was out of her control, what I was doing, and why. She signed. Her hand was steady. I contacted Harold's original estate attorney, a retired man in Brunswick who still kept records. He faxed me a copy of Harold's 2004 will, the one that had been clear, notarized, witnessed, and entirely bypassed by the power of attorney Susan had obtained in 2019. I called Dorothy's primary care physician's office. I could not access the records myself. Dorothy had to request them. She did. And what those records showed was that at Dorothy's appointment in February of 2019, 4 weeks before Susan took her to Raymond Doyle's office, her physician had noted that she was alert, oriented, and showing no signs of cognitive decline. She had passed every standard cognitive screening question. Her memory was intact. Her judgment was intact. Wyatt, but... In other words, when Dorothy signed that power of attorney, she had been medically verified as fully competent, which meant the document itself was not voidable on grounds of incapacity. But Thomas had told me to look at something else. He told me to look at the circumstances of the signing. Had Dorothy been given independent counsel? Had she had time to review the document before signing? Had anyone else been present in the room? I asked Dorothy all 3 questions on a Sunday afternoon phone call, with Thomas on the line. She said Susan had driven her there. Susan had been in the room the entire time. The attorney, Raymond Doyle, had explained the document, but Susan had been the one to tell Dorothy it was routine paperwork, just for emergencies. Dorothy had not had independent counsel. She had not reviewed the document in advance. She had been told they were just stopping by to handle some things Harold should have set up years ago. That phrase, things Harold should have set up years ago. Susan had used Harold against her, had used the ghost of his practical failures, the paperwork he had never finished, to make Dorothy feel that signing this document was completing something unfinished rather than surrendering something irreplaceable. I wrote that down, word for word, exactly as Dorothy remembered it. I dated the note. I had Dorothy confirm it in writing in a separate letter that Thomas drafted. That letter became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. If you know someone whose elderly parent or grandparent is in a situation that feels like this, where someone close to them has just a little too much access, just a little too much control, please share this, because the window to act is always smaller than you think it is. By the time Thomas and I had a complete picture of the transfers, the number was no longer $340,000. It was $1.1 million. Over 22 months. From 4 separate accounts. Through a combination of direct transfers to a joint account Susan had opened at a different bank, cash withdrawals that Dorothy could not account for, a real estate transaction involving a rental property Harold had owned that had been sold, with Dorothy's signature, without Dorothy having any clear memory of agreeing to sell it, and a series of smaller transfers to what appeared to be a home improvement business, registered in Dale Voss's name. Dale, Susan's husband. The home improvement business had one client on record, Dorothy Mercer. $1.1 million. Extracted from a 79-year-old woman by her daughter and son-in-law. In 22 months. While the rest of the family trusted that everything was fine, because Susan said it was fine. And nobody asked Dorothy directly. I sat with Thomas in his office when he laid out the complete accounting, and I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I had done my crying in the car. In my apartment at 2 a.m. On the phone with my mother the night she finally admitted that she had suspected something was wrong for longer than she had told me. In Thomas's office, I did not cry. I picked up my pen and I said, "What do we do next?" We were 2 hours into our 3rd meeting with Thomas when he did it. We had been going through the transfer documentation, cross-referencing dates, organizing the timeline. My mother had finally come on board fully. She was there that day. sitting beside me, her reading glasses on, making notes in a spiral notebook she had bought specifically for this. Gregory had retained his own attorney in Raleigh and was coordinating with Thomas. We were building something. Thomas set the first folder, the one he had been working from since our first meeting, off to the side of his desk. He aligned the edges the way precise people do when they are putting something away, and then he reached under his desk, to the lower left drawer, and he brought out a second folder, thinner than the first one. Manila. No label on the tab. He set it on the desk between us, and did not open it immediately. He said, "I want to show you something that I should have shown you at our first meeting. I did not, because I needed to verify it independently before I presented it. I have now done that." My mother took her reading glasses off. I put my pen down. Thomas opened the folder. Inside was a single document, 8 pages, dated September 14th, 2020, 6 weeks before my mother had found the first transfers. 6 weeks before the voicemail. 6 weeks before any of us had begun to understand what was happening. It was a deed of transfer for Dorothy's house. The house in Savannah. The one Harold and Dorothy had paid off together over 20 years. The one that smelled like gardenias and lemon soap. The one with the screened-in porch where I learned to play gin rummy. The one worth approximately $580,000 at current market valuation. Signed over to Susan Ann Voss, with Dorothy's signature at the bottom. Thomas said Dorothy had been taken to a notary on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to sign some updated homeowners insurance forms. The notary, who Thomas had tracked down and spoken with, remembered the appointment. She remembered Susan being present. She remembered Dorothy seeming, in her words, a little quiet. She had not asked any questions. She had notarized the signature. The deed had been filed with the Chatham County Recorder's Office 4 days later. Dorothy had not known she no longer owned her house. She had been living in it for 6 weeks, thinking it was still hers. And that was the moment something inside me went very, very still. Not anger, not outrage, something colder than both of those things. Something that does not have a clean name, but that I think of now as the moment I stopped being Dorothy's grieving granddaughter and became something else entirely. I became the person who was going to make sure Susan Voss answered for every single one of those 22 months. Here is what most people do not understand about elder financial abuse cases in the United States. They are extraordinarily common. They are extraordinarily hard to prosecute. And the reason they are hard to prosecute has nothing to do with the law being unclear and everything to do with the fact that the evidence is almost always buried inside a relationship, inside years of family, dinners and birthday cards, and the word love being used as both a shield and a weapon simultaneously. Thomas told me that on our very first meeting. He said, "The law is not your problem. The family is your problem." He was right, but by January of 2021, the family had stopped being my problem. My mother was fully committed. She had stopped using the word rift. Gregory had retained his own counsel and was prepared to be a co-complainant. Dorothy, and this is the part that required the most from her, the part I will never stop being grateful for, Dorothy had agreed to participate, to give a recorded statement, to sit across from a camera and tell the truth about what had happened inside her own house, in her own kitchen, at her own table. She wore her good blue cardigan the day we recorded it. She had her hair done. She sat up straight the entire time. She did not cry once. Thomas filed a complaint with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Elder Abuse Unit in February of 2021. He filed a separate civil suit on Dorothy's behalf against Susan Ann Voss and Dale Voss, alleging financial exploitation of an elder, fraud, undue influence, and breach of fiduciary duty under the power of attorney. He also referred the matter to the Chatham County District Attorney's Office for potential criminal review. And then, he did one more thing. One thing I had not anticipated, and that changed the entire landscape of what came next. He contacted Raymond Doyle, the attorney who had drawn up the power of attorney, the attorney who had sat in a room with my grandmother and Susan, and watched Susan do the talking, and notarized the whole arrangement, without once asking Dorothy if she wanted independent counsel. Thomas sent Raymond Doyle a very polite letter, outlining what he had found, what he intended to file, and what he believed Doyle's professional exposure might look like if the matter proceeded to litigation. Raymond Doyle called Thomas back within 24 hours. And Raymond Doyle, it turned out, had kept very thorough notes. While Thomas was filing and contacting and building, Susan was not sitting still either. This is the part of the story that still makes me exhale slowly when I think about it. Because Susan, operating from the assumption that the family was too fractured and too conflict-averse to mount a real response, kept going. In January of 2021, the same month Thomas and I were finalizing our complaint, Susan listed Dorothy's house for sale, the house that was now in Susan's name. The house on Savannah's east side, the one worth approximately $580,000. She listed it at $565,000. She had a buyer within 3 weeks. Dorothy did not know the house was listed. She found out because a neighbor, a woman named Gloria, who had lived 2 doors down from Dorothy for 31 years, saw the for sale sign in the yard and called Dorothy to ask where she was moving. Dorothy called me from that kitchen, the one with the gardenias outside and the lemon soap smell. She called me, and her voice was completely level, and she said, "Gloria tells me there is a sign in my yard." I told her I knew. I told her we were handling it. I told her not to call Susan. She said, I was not going to. We moved to block the sale within 48 hours. Thomas filed an emergency motion with the Chatham County Superior Court to place a lis pendens on the property, a legal notice that the title was under dispute and could not be transferred. The motion was granted. The buyer walked away. Susan's real estate agent called her the afternoon the lis pendens was recorded. I was not in that conversation. But I was told later, by someone who was, that Susan did not say anything for a very long time after she heard the news. That silence. I think about it sometimes. I think about what it must have felt like to realize, in that moment, that the family she had counted on to stay quiet had not stayed quiet. There was a meeting. I want to be careful about how much I describe it, for reasons that will become clear in a moment. It took place in Thomas's office in Columbia on a Saturday in March of 2021. Present were Thomas, my mother Gregory, Gregory's attorney, myself, Susan, and the attorney Susan had retained, a woman named Deborah Chance, who specialized in civil litigation, and who, by the expression on her face when she sat down, had already told Susan what the likely trajectory of this was going to be. Dale was not present. Dale had retained his own counsel separately. Susan walked in wearing a gray blazer and carrying a leather portfolio. Her hair was neat. Her face was composed. She looked exactly like someone who had prepared very hard to look like someone who had done nothing wrong. Thomas opened by presenting the complete financial accounting. Every transfer, every date, every account, the home improvement business invoices, the beneficiary change, the house deed, the recorded statement from Dorothy, the notes from Raymond Doyle, the medical records establishing Dorothy's competency at the time of signing. He laid it out without editorializing, without drama, in the flat, procedural language of someone who has assembled a mechanism and is simply demonstrating how it works. Susan's attorney leaned over and whispered something to her halfway through. Susan did not look at any of us. She looked at the table. At the edge of the table, specifically, that particular strip of wood right at the rim, and she kept her eyes there for the rest of the presentation. When Thomas finished, he said he was prepared to proceed with both the civil suit and to cooperate fully with the criminal referral, unless the parties were interested in discussing a resolution. Deborah Chance asked for a 15-minute recess. They were gone for 47 minutes. When they came back, Susan did not speak. Deborah Chance spoke. She said her client was prepared to discuss terms. My mother made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Like something releasing. I kept my face still. The civil settlement took 4 more months to finalize. I cannot share every detail of it. There are confidentiality provisions that I am required to respect. But I can tell you the broad shape of what happened. The house was returned to Dorothy's name. The deed transfer was voided as a product of fraud and undue influence. Susan signed a quitclaim deed in July of 2021. The financial recovery, the money, was more complicated. Susan and Dale did not have $1.1 million sitting in an account somewhere. Some of it had been spent. The home improvements they had made to their own house in Savannah. A boat Dale had purchased in 2020. Tuition payments for Marcus's graduate program. Credit card debt they had paid off. The money had been absorbed into their life, dissolved into it. The settlement required them to liquidate what they could, the boat, certain investment accounts, the rental income from a property Dale owned, and to enter into a structured repayment arrangement for the remainder. The total recovered, including the house, was valued at approximately $1.3 million of the original $1.9 that Dorothy had held before Susan's involvement began. The remaining gap, the difference between what was recovered and what the estate had been before, was simply gone. Pause. Let that number breathe. Gone. Not recovered, not restored, gone. And the criminal case. I need to tell you about the criminal case, because this is the part that people always want to know, and the answer is not the one anyone wants to hear. The Chatham County District Attorney's Office reviewed the referral. They determined there was sufficient evidence to pursue charges. Susan was charged with 1 count of exploitation of an elder person and 2 counts of financial fraud under Georgia law. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of financial exploitation of an elder, a felony, in exchange for the other charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 8 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to comply with the civil repayment terms. She served no prison time. No prison time. I am going to give you a moment with that, because I needed a moment with it too. I really want to know what you think about that outcome. Would you have accepted it? Because I am still not sure I have. If this story is sitting with you the way it sat with me, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done differently. I read them. Every single one. The day the house was officially returned to Dorothy's name, Thomas called me to confirm the recording had been filed with the county. I was in my car in a parking lot in Charlotte. It was August. The heat was coming off the asphalt in visible waves, and the air conditioning in my car was doing its best, but not quite succeeding. And when Thomas said the words "it is done," I sat there for a moment and did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had expected relief, or triumph, or something clean and definitive. What I felt was tired, the particular exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from sustained vigilance, from 10 months of keeping myself precise and organized and forward-moving when every instinct I had wanted to collapse into grief or rage. I drove to Savannah that weekend. Dorothy was in the kitchen. She had made coffee. She had set out the shortbread cookies in the tin. The house smelled exactly like it had always smelled. Gardenias and lemon soap and that faint wood warmth underneath everything. And I sat down at the table, and she sat across from me, and we drank our coffee without talking for a little while. Then she said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Anything." She said, "Do you think she knew it was wrong when she was doing it?" I looked at my grandmother. I thought about all of it. The transfers, the attorney's office, the house listing, the composed gray blazer in Thomas's conference room, the eyes fixed on the edge of the table. I thought about the phrase things Harold should have set up years ago. I said, "Yes. I think she knew." Dorothy nodded. She looked down at her coffee mug. She turned it once in her hands, this slow, deliberate rotation, and then she set it back down and she said, "I know she did too. I think I knew at the time. I just did not want it to be true." And there it was. The thing I had been circling around for 10 months without being able to name it directly. Dorothy had not been confused. Dorothy had not been deceived in the simple, clean way that word implies. Dorothy had known, on some level, that something was wrong, and she had chosen, out of love, or loneliness, or the particular exhaustion of being 79 and widowed and not wanting to be the kind of mother who accuses her youngest child, she had chosen to not know it fully, to let the knowing stay in the peripheral vision instead of looking at it directly. I understood that. I did not judge it. I had done a smaller version of the same thing in that parking lot after Thanksgiving 2018, when I filed away the notch on the wall and did not take it back out for 8 months. We are all, in our own ways, choosing what we are ready to see. My mother and Susan have not spoken since the settlement. Not once. There have been holidays that nobody attended because nobody could figure out how to arrange the seating. There have been birthdays acknowledged by text message and funerals that required careful choreography of arrivals and departures so that certain people would not be in the same room. Gregory talks to Susan occasionally. He says he does it for Dorothy's sake, so that Dorothy does not have to feel that her family has completely fractured because of her. I understand his reasoning. I do not share his capacity for it. Marcus, Susan's son, my first cousin, sent me a message about 8 months after the settlement. He said he was sorry, that he had not known the full extent of it. that he was ashamed. He asked if we could talk sometime. I have not responded to that message yet. It has been over a year. I look at it sometimes, and I try to figure out what I would say, and I cannot find the right words, and so I close it again. That is its own kind of unfinished business. Dale and Susan are still married. They sold their house in Savannah, not the one Dorothy owned, their own house, and moved to somewhere in Florida. I do not know exactly where, and I have not tried to find out. Dorothy is still in her house. She still drives the Buick, though it is a newer one now. She still clips coupons. She still sends birthday cards that arrive exactly on the right day with handwritten notes that reference the last thing you said to her. She had a new will drafted. She appointed my mother and Gregory as co-trustees of her estate. She appointed me as the person to be called first if anything ever seems wrong. I take that responsibility with both hands. People ask me sometimes if I feel like justice was served. I usually pause before I answer. Not because I do not know what I think, but because I want to be precise about it. Because precision is what this whole experience taught me the value of. The house is back. Most of the money is accounted for. Susan has a felony on her record. Dorothy is safe. Those things are real. Those things matter. But justice as a complete thing, as a system that measures what was taken against what was returned and finds them equal, that did not happen. It rarely does. The settlement recovered approximately 70% of what was lost. The probation means Susan walks to her mailbox every morning in Florida like anyone else. The 8 years will pass. And the things that cannot be quantified, the 2 years Dorothy spent not fully trusting her own instincts, the silence she kept because she did not want to be a burden, the shame she felt in her own kitchen at her own table, those things have no line item in any settlement document. So no, I do not feel like justice was fully served. What I feel is that we did the most that the available tools allowed us to do, and that those tools are imperfect and partial, and designed in ways that consistently underestimate the damage done by the slow, quiet, intimate kind of theft. The kind that hides inside love. The kind that is perpetrated not by strangers, but by people whose phone numbers are saved in your grandmother's contacts under a name that means daughter. Here is what I know. If my mother had not found those bank statements, if I had not driven to Savannah alone, if Dorothy had not agreed to sit up straight in her good blue cardigan and tell the truth on camera, if Thomas Whitfield had not reached into that lower left drawer, if any single one of those things had not happened, Susan would have sold that house. Dorothy would have been removed from it, gently, carefully, with some story about needing more support, about assisted living being the right next step. The estate would have been fully dissolved before Dorothy's death, leaving nothing for my mother or Gregory, leaving Susan and Dale with everything Harold and Dorothy had built across 40 years of careful, patient accumulation. And Dorothy would have died not knowing she had been robbed, or worse, knowing and staying silent, because she still did not want to be a burden. I do not have a clean ending for you. I am sorry if you came here for one. What I have is this. My grandmother is 80 years old now. She is in her house. The gardenias on the side of the house bloomed early this year, and she sent me a photograph of them on a Tuesday morning with no caption. Just the picture. I have it saved. I look at it more than makes sense. And if you are sitting somewhere right now thinking about someone in your life, an elderly parent, a grandparent, someone whose mail is being handled by someone else, whose accounts have been made more convenient, whose silence you have been interpreting as peace, I want you to go have that conversation. The direct one. The one that feels uncomfortable. Have it before you need an attorney. Have it before there is a second folder. Have it now, while there is still time for it to just be a conversation between people who love each other. Dorothy told me once, near the end of all of this, that the thing she was most grateful for was not the house. It was not the money, or the settlement, or the felony record. She said the thing she was most grateful for was that someone had asked her directly, that someone had sat across from her and looked at her and said, "Grandma, I need you to tell me the truth." She said, "I have been waiting for someone to ask me that for 2 years." Ask the people you love the hard questions, before someone else's silence becomes their answer. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone you know, or a situation you have been half watching without fully looking at, share it. You might be the person who asked the right question at the right time. And if you want more stories like this one, you know where to find them.